I invite you to get out your missalette and turn to page 46. We'll be looking at the gospel today, but reading along with it what was one of the readings from Christmas time regarding Joseph and what was going on with him. It's a very interesting text. And what I ask you this morning, as I mentioned earlier, is very significant. What makes the Holy Family holy? To answer that, really we need to know, well, what does it mean to be holy? Usually when we think of holiness, being holy, we think of somebody who's without sin, of course, and righteous and perfect in every way. But in actuality, the understanding of a holy family, or anybody who's holy, is the idea of being set aside for God. A saint is holy because their lives, her or his lives, were set aside for the purpose and totally for worship of God and how they acted and how they treated their neighbor. And in fact, the word in Latin, sanctus, is the word for holy. And that's why in our lectionaries, a lot of times if you read a letter from St. Paul, an epistle to a church, he says, to the holy ones. So you also are called to be holy. That being the case, what is it that makes the Holy Family holy? Because obviously, as we said in our first prayer today, we're trying to emulate them and follow their example. Well, when I was looking at this text, I came across two things that makes them holy. The first, of course, is the big J. No, I don't mean Joseph. What's the big J? Jesus. Kids, if you're an RE and if your teacher asks you a question, just say Jesus. The answer is always Jesus. And Jesus is the answer. Because of Christ, they are the Holy Family. It started with Mary's fiat. You know Mary's fiat, right? Where the angel Gabriel comes to her and says, "Will you be the mother of God?" And she said, "Let it be unto me as according to your word." At that moment, she was set aside. She was sanctified, consecrated to be holy for this mission of Jesus Christ. What we don't realize often or think about is that the moment she said yes to God, to be the mother of God, mother of the Son of God, Christ came between her and Joseph. At that moment, Jesus came between them. Look at page 46. We're down towards the bottom of it. You see where it says, "Now this," toward the end of that on page 46, this is the gospel in Matthew. "Now this is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph before they lived together." In other words, in Jewish culture, they were already married officially. They just didn't cohabit yet. They hadn't consummated their marriage. "She was found with child through the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since she was a righteous man, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her quietly." And then on. And then an angel says, "Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home. It's through the Holy Spirit this child has been conceived." And then it says, "He did as the angel said and took his wife into his home." Joseph had a fiat. He had a choice. When Christ came between Mary and Joseph, when he understood, he said yes. And then from that moment on, Christ was the center of their lives. From that moment on, everything they did, and that's the second point, that what made the family holy was when Christ became the center, their lives were designed for the mission of Jesus Christ. From that moment on, everything became difficult. Can you imagine somebody, a king, 2 generations of kings in a royal family trying to kill your son? They stuck with it. Their mission didn't separate them. Christ between them brought them together, made them one in love and in purpose. It made them strong. It made them holier and holier and holier. They became refugees. And I think we in the Catholic Church should have great sympathy for refugees from places like Honduras and Mexico, where there's a lot of violence, where people are fleeing to protect their children. And not only is this so, but can you imagine for a moment being the parent of Jesus Christ, even the godparent, or rather the step-parent or a foster parent of Christ, the Son of God? I don't think I'd want to be the father of Jesus. Can you imagine? Well, who do you think you are, young man? The Son of God or something? Well, yeah. Oh, okay. But just being the parent of the Son of God, Jesus will always be separate from the expectations of the world around them. He's not just the Son of Man, He's the Son of God. And we see that played out in these little hints in the gospel. For example, when Jesus is 12 and the family goes on their annual trip to Jerusalem, 100 miles from where they lived, and they're heading on their way back with their extended family, Jesus stays and doesn't tell anybody. They take 3 days and find Him in the temple talking theology with all the smart people. And Jesus just says, well, where else would you expect me to be? That would be hard. To be the Holy Family was not easy. Or think about this. Jesus, later in His life, as He's an adult, He goes on an itinerant mission for 3 years, becomes homeless. His mother is watching this. And as He's ministering to the point where He's caring for people so much that He becomes probably a bit emaciated and deprived of sleep and strength, and people said He's beside himself. He's going a little nutty from the ministry, His sacrifice, because He was driven as the Son of God. Mary and His brothers, stepbrothers, go to pick Him up, and you know what He says when they come? Somebody tells Jesus in a house, your family is here to get you. He doesn't say thank you. He says, well, who is my family? Who is my mother and my brothers? It's those who do the will of God. Ouch. Think of how that would hurt. And yet the love they had for one another, the strength, the perseverance to fulfill that mission to which they were called, kept them going and strengthened them and made them holier. And don't for a second think that Jesus didn't have to learn to become more and more of a family. Yes, He's holy as the Son of God and Son of Man, but it says in Hebrews 5, He learned obedience through suffering. We don't even know what happened to Joseph. He just disappears when Jesus is grown up. He must have passed away, and so the family had to deal with that loss as well. But they stuck with it as a family and love and commitment to the mission of being a follower of Jesus. So what about you? What makes your family holy? Interesting thought, huh? Are you holy? How do you measure holiness? The same way as the Holy Family. Christ must come between you and your loved ones. He will have it no other way. I came from a family where I was inspired. I believe the Holy Spirit came to me and gave me this strong faith in God, and the rest of my family, a number of them, did not receive that. Christ came between me and my loved ones. And you stick it out, and you know what happens? God brought them in, because that's what family does. And if you are one of those people who's made a lot of mistakes in your life, like me, it's okay, because God can work through those things also to make you holy. And you as a holy family in that mission to which God calls you, you remain faithful, you persevere, and make the choices that are pleasing to God, even when it's hard. Even when you go through loss and sadness and difficulty, you keep after Jesus. You draw closer together. And what you find is that the very things that were meant to take you down strengthen you, increase your love. You should love your family more a year from now than you do now, because that's God making you holy. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that wonderful that the mission of God is to bring you closer together as you draw closer to Jesus? Well, what does this look like? What does this holiness look like? You know I'm going to forget this here. What does it look like? As many of you may know, I've mentioned it before, I'm a great admirer of Fred Rogers. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He died about 10 years ago, 15 years ago now. But when he would talk to the camera, he would talk to the individuals, and he would somehow let them know he loved them. And people would say, "He's the father I never had." Well, there was this teenager in California. This is a true story. Teenager in California, and he had a severe case of cerebral palsy where he could not talk. He had to talk through a computer. And he would shake so much that he couldn't control himself, and he would be so upset and angry that he would hit himself at times. He felt that God must not love him. And there was one thing that gave him hope, that inspired him, and that was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Even as a teenager, he would listen to Fred Rogers and find inspiration there. Well, one year, his mother learned, and they were just the two of them, that was family, that was their holy family. One year, she learned that Fred Rogers was going to come from his home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to California to meet Coco the gorilla. You remember the gorilla that could talk in sign language? And there was actually a show done on that. But they had arranged, I think through a secondary source, a mediator, for him to come to the boy's house and meet him. And the boy was very excited and very nervous. So Fred Rogers comes, and the boy is so excited, he can't control himself. His hands are shaking, and he's getting more and more anxious and nervous, and he finally has a meltdown and gets so upset, he starts to beat himself. So the mother ushers him out of the room into his bedroom to quiet him down, and Fred Rogers is just waiting in the living room for as long as it took. And then she brings him back out, and Fred Rogers is talking to him, and he says to him, "Will you do something for me? Will you do something for me?" And he says, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Will you pray for me?" And the little boy says, I don't know how to pray, but I'll do my best." And he says, "Yeah, I'll do that for you." And he was shocked, boy, because people always said they would pray for him. Now somebody's asking him to pray for them. Well, Fred Rogers was relating this story to a journalist by the name of Tom. I just read this story a couple days ago. I just ran across it, probably because that movie's coming out. But Tom says to Mr. Rogers, when he was still alive at the time, he said, "That was really smart of you, to get the boy to have something to live for and to look outward and give him a purpose." And Fred Rogers looked at him for a minute, kind of surprised, and he says, "No, you don't understand, Tom. I asked him to pray because to have gone through everything he's experienced, he's got to be close to God. He has to be close to God. I did it so he would pray for me because of his connection with God." Will you pray for me? Will you pray for me? I know many of you, and I know the things you've gone through have not always been easy. And I've walked through some of those with you. And I know that for all the difficulty and the hardship that you've gone through and to be here today, you've got to be close to God. Will you pray for me? You pray for me, and I'll pray for you.